Okay, so just to reiterate one more time, the point that I want to make relative to these two protocol sheets for both heifers and cows is please make sure that when you are referring to these, that you're working with the most current year, because as I said, these are reviewed annually based on the most recent data, and essentially they're reviewed not only by the group of academics that work in this area across the nation, but they're also reviewed by the pharmaceutical houses as well as the AI companies. And more or less, it's the best collective decision in terms of ensuring that the information that's presented on these protocol sheets is the best that we have at the time. The one point that I want to make with regard to all of your understanding in terms of these protocols is that none of them, as you will see, involve estradiol. And the point that I want to emphasize here, and it's an important one, is that estradiol products are not legally available for estrus synchronization in the United States. And to add on to that, I would caution you in that FDA has warned veterinarians and pharmacies against compounding estradiol products for use in food animals. So this is serious. They are enforcing it in different parts of the country, and so I think it's important not only for those of you as individual producers, but the industry as a whole to adhere to these recommendations or requirements. So in moving forward, then to kind of get into the meat of the talk, there are some things that I want to touch on briefly relative to some general management considerations related to synchronization and timed AI programs. And one of the things that we were first faced with, and I think many of you that either have considered using timed artificial insemination or have experience with it, one of the questions that first came up to our group was people understood the fact that you were going to set up cows based on whatever protocol you were using to essentially breed a group of cows on the same day. And at the same time, the question relative to more or less concern was what's going to happen at calving. So in other words, do we know what to expect at calving from cows that conceive on the same day to the same sire? So with the work that we've done over the years, we really wanted to evaluate this. And so what this slide represents are each of these panels represent different groups of cows that were all appointment bred using semen from a single sire. The sires are listed in the top of each of those bar graphs. But all of these cows were appointment bred on a given day. Cleanup bulls were not exposed to these cows for a period of 2 weeks. And then early ultrasounds were performed on the cows to confirm status relative to AI conception. And then everything was reconfirmed at calving. And so you can see within each of these panels the range in days of gestation and then the actual mean day of gestation at which time calves were born. And so the green bars in each of these bar graphs represents day 283 of gestation. And so essentially what you can see illustrated here is the fact that a fairly high percentage of those calvings fall on either side. But the important point is what that actual range is. When we boiled all the data down, essentially what we found is that for any given group of cows that are inseminated and conceive on the same day to a particular sire, the maximum number of cows that actually calve on the peak day of the calving season is roughly 20%. So I want you to work through the math with me just for a moment to kind of illustrate my point. So if I breed 100 cows tomorrow morning and 60 of those cows conceive of the 100 that I inseminate, and 20% of those cows calve on the peak day of the calving season, that's essentially 12 cows calving on that peak day. And what we've found working with the herds across the U.S. that we have engaged with over the years, really in most cases what we've found is that producers actually like what they see in terms of that calving profile. And in many cases, the feedback we get is they feel like they're doing a better job managing their cows over a shorter or narrow window of time. The other thing I think you have to consider is the impact of synchronization on calving distribution. And for those of you that subscribe to Beef Magazine and follow Harlan Hughes, I was on the faculty at the University of Kentucky for a number of years before I moved to Mizzou. And Harlan worked with our group at UK for a time during a sabbatic that he took over a course of about a year. But if you follow his economic analysis of the cattle industry in terms of cow-calf, basically what he reports is that increased profits generally result from moving later calving cows forward toward the first and second calving intervals, and that high production herds see that or realize that roughly 61% of the calves are born by day 21, 85% by day 42, and 94% by day 63. So this is some data from our university research herds, and what's represented here are 4 years worth of data involving the herds within our system and roughly 1,500 calvings. All of these cows were exposed for one fixed time AI, and then 2 weeks later, in each case, again the cleanup bulls went in, and then they were exposed subsequently for roughly a 60-day breeding season from the point of fixed time AI. What we found in the 4 herds that were involved, and you pool that data, basically by day 15, 65% of the cows had calved. By day 21, 70%. By day 30, 82%. By day 42, 93%. So you can see relative to Harlan Hughes' data, the efficiency in terms of how you're grouping those cows at calving is significant, not only in terms of increased uniformity of those calves at weaning, but the other thing you have to consider is that the pool of replacement heifers you have to select from then also is a real advantage in terms of how these protocols and systems work. This is a research herd, an illustration from a research herd that my students and I have worked with for a number of years. And Daniel Schaefer, who was a former graduate student of mine, put these data together but to really illustrate a point. And before our group began working with this herd, it's a commercial Angus herd of roughly 250 Angus cows, straight bred Angus. And essentially, what's shown here is the line that's highlighted in more or less orange represents the period of time prior to the work that we initiated involving synchronization programs. And during those early years, they were not using synchronization in any form, and nor were they using artificial insemination. That said, you can see that it's a very well managed herd, and based on how the cows performed in terms of that calving profile as a result of natural service, that's a very that's a very good performing herd in terms of their reproductive profile. The point that I want to make is that as you move into that blue line, then those are the years that we imposed synchronization with the aid of heat watch. So all the cows were being inseminated with the aid of heat watch. Those of you that may not be familiar with heat watch, it's a computerized heat detection system. So basically, we get very precise data in terms of when the cows come in heat, the number of mounts they experience, and then we base inseminations off of that. And so it was obvious to us that shift would occur because we more or less took control of those cows' estrus cycles. But what really surprised us is that line furthest to the left, which more or less then occurred following our imposition or use of fixed time AI. And I think that really highlights the fact that what you can see occur over a period of time by beginning use of first synchronization programs and artificial insemination, but the subsequent or cumulative effects of these practices or procedures in terms of estrus cycle control really can improve performance in your herd in terms of concentrating not only the breeding season, obviously, but more importantly, what occurs at calving. So I want to move now into a discussion of protocols, and I want to begin with heifers. And again, the protocols that are shown on this sheet represent have you focus on the protocols here at the bottom that highlight the fixed time AI protocols. So you can see more or less there are two short-term protocols, the 7-day and the 5-day coast-sync cedar protocol, and the two longer-term protocols, the 14-day cedar and the MGA prostaglandin protocol. So I want to begin the discussion first with the long-term progestin-based protocols. And again, melengesterol acetate, for those of you that may or may be familiar with it, but perhaps not. MGA is an orally active progestin. It's administered through the feed, fed at a dosage of 0.5 milligram per head per day. My group has done significant work over the years prior to the approval of the cedars with melengesterol acetate. It's highly effective, but the whole key to it is intake. And so our recommendation would be to feed it at about the same time every day in a grain mix carrier, roughly 3 to 5 pounds. We don't recommend top dressing it onto, for instance, a silage diet. But if you're able to get adequate intake into the cattle on a daily basis, it should work very well. The other product, which probably more of you are maybe using at the present time, would be the cedar, and suffice to say, the convenience factor relative to use of the cedars is a big benefit in terms of ensuring that cattle that go on that treatment are getting the recommended dosage on a daily basis during the time the cedars are inserted. So we had an interest in comparing the two protocols head to head. In this case, 14 days of MGA followed in 19 days with the administration of prostaglandin, and the 14-day cedar, in which case there's a 16-day interval as opposed to a 19-day interval between cedar removal and prostaglandin. The initial studies that we were involved with, we had the luxury of working with a large heifer development facility. Circle A ranches here in Missouri would send all their heifers to a central developing site on the Missouri-Iowa line. And the luxury we had in terms of supporting our research program in this area was the fact that we could put roughly up to 500 heifers at a time on heat watch and get very precise heat information on those heifers to really more or less pinpoint timing relative to time AI. So this is a depiction of what you can expect to occur in terms of estrus distribution following MGA withdrawal from the feed or actual physical removal of the cedar. And what you'll see is that there's a much more robust expression of estrus among heifers that are placed on the 14-day cedar. In many cases, it's almost like a bomb goes off because the heat activity is so intense and so robust over a short period of time. And the difference is more or less the way each of those products physiologically clear the animal system. And so because of the feed additive difference in comparison to the actual cedar device, there is more of a delayed with more or less clearance from the animal system. And so that's why you see the differences relative to heat profiles coming off either of the two treatments. This, however, is when it really matters. And so this is, again, the distribution of estrus after prostaglandin. This is also a head-to-head comparison looking at what occurred relative to heat expression with the aid of heat watch. And although these two bar graphs, the black bars represent the MGA-treated heifers, the gray bars represent the cedar-treated heifers, when you more or less run the statistics on this in terms of the variance for interval estrus, essentially the degree of synchrony is enhanced among the heifers that were assigned to the 14-day cedar as opposed to the MGA-treated heifers. We then put the two protocols head-to-head in terms of timed insemination. And in this case, the MGA heifers are appointment bred at 72 hours following the administration of prostaglandin in comparison to the cedar-treated heifers. And those heifers are inseminated. The recommended time is 66 hours following the administration of prostaglandin. And in both cases, you'll see that based on this initial work, then GnRH was administered concurrent with AI. So without going into all the actual numbers, but to boil the data down in terms of what we actually saw was that When AI was performed on observed estrus, comparing the two protocols, there were no differences in the synchronized conception or pregnancy rates that resulted or occurred between either the two protocols. And then Rick Funston's group at the University of Nebraska put the two head-to-head in terms of comparing them based on fixed time AI, and again reported no difference. And so that being said, I think the important point here is that both products work very effectively. But again, I'd highlight the fact that in order to have success or realize success with the NJ-based protocols, the intake point is really critical. So I want to move now to the 7-day co-sync CEDAR protocol in heifers, and essentially it's a very simple system: GnRH of CEDAR insertion, 7 days later prostaglandin and CEDAR removal. So in other words, a Monday. So CEDARs would go in on a Monday, that would come out on a Monday, and then heifers are appointment bred. The recommended time is at 54 hours after CEDAR removal and prostaglandin, and again, GnRH is administered concurrent with insemination. The 5-day system is more of an abbreviated system. The CEDAR is only in place for a period of 5 days as opposed to 7. GnRH, however, is administered at the time CEDARs are inserted. And what you see differing in this case is the fact that the protocol actually calls for 2 injections of prostaglandin administered roughly 8 plus or minus 2 hours apart. And the reason for this is that when you administer GnRH at the beginning of the protocol, at the time CEDARs are inserted, basically if there's a follicle large enough or a dominant follicle large enough to more or less respond to that GnRH injection and essentially turn over, you'll have form what is referred to as an accessory corpus luteum. Because of that shortened 5-day interval, essentially 1 injection of prostaglandin is not going to be adequate in terms of successfully lysing the CL. And so that's why the recommendation is to come back with a second injection, the number of hours later, to really successfully lyse that CL, to enable all of the heifers to exhibit or express estrus following CEDAR removal and administration of those 2 injections. And in this case, what you can see is then following CEDAR removal and administration of that first injection of prostaglandin, a period of 60 hours is recommended to then perform AI, and again, GnRH is administered concurrent with AI. So what I've shown here on this table is a comparison of the 7-day and the 5-day and the 14-day and the 5-day protocols based on the published literature. And the point that I want to refer to in terms of any statistical or actual biological difference, although there's numeric differences you can see here based on the various studies that were conducted, the only study that showed any significant advantage of one protocol over the other was an advantage of the 5-day protocol over the 7-day protocol, with the work that's highlighted in this particular slide. And so you can see there was a significant advantage to the 5-day protocol in comparison to the 7-day, but again, no differences in terms of the comparisons of the other protocols. So one of the points that we've really emphasized in our program here in Missouri, which we feel has really supported an increase in overall use of artificial insemination, not only in heifers, but improvements in reproductive performance in general of herds that we've had the privilege of working with, is really this whole concept of performing pre-breeding examinations or reproductive tract scores. And I know there's some skeptics relative to this, but I think the point that we've learned from this is that they in fact are worth doing. We actually have some interest now. Dr. Jared Decker and our group here at MSU is actually going to be looking more at the genetics in relation to these reproductive tract scores, because basically it's a phenotypic expression of a very important reproductive trait, i.e. puberty. But the consideration that he's interested in looking at is that can we learn more about the actual genetics of puberty onset, and in using this as a phenotypic expression of that very important trait. So essentially, the TRACT scoring system allows us to perform an assessment of reproductive development or pubertal status. And to boil it down simplistically, the scores range from 1 to 5, 1 being an infantile TRACT, 2s and 3s. Those heifers are considered to be non-cycling or pre or peripubertal. And as you can see, relative to the difference in the 2s versus the 3s, this system was actually developed at Colorado State University. But basically, the idea would be that the heifer that scores a 2 would be greater than 30 days out from reaching puberty, whereas a score of 3 would be within a month of reaching puberty. And then scores of 4s and 5s, those heifers are both considered to be cyclic or having reached puberty, but they're just at different stages of the estrus cycle. So a score of 4 would indicate that the heifer is actually either in heat or on the verge of coming into heat. So she's in the follicular phase of her cycle, whereas a score of 5 would indicate that the heifer actually is somewhere probably between day 6 and 16 of her cycle, and more or less in the luteal phase. So Mike Day's group, when he was at Ohio State, basically developed this really nice cartoon in terms of depicting the endocrine changes that actually endocrine and ovarian changes that are associated with puberty onset. And the point that I want to make, I don't want to belabor this, but you need to understand some of the basic physiology related to puberty onset, and then really how then you can assess that in terms of assignment of these reproductive tract scores. So as you move from that prepubertal to peripubertal to more or less cyclic status on these heifers, basically you transition from more or less extreme sensitivity to estradiol negative feedback, which translates then into differences in terms of what's happening at the level of the brain in terms of LH secretion. So what you can see in that early prepubertal period, the sensitivity is increased relative to estrogen feedback. That results in high amplitude, low frequency LH pulses. But then as you move across across those rows, then you can see that sensitivity to estrogen feedback or estradiol feedback begins to diminish. And as that change occurs, then roughly what you can see happening then is that those changes in LH pulses essentially transition from high amplitude, low frequency to a greater occurrence of higher frequency, lower amplitude pulses. What that translates into then at the level of the ovary is more or less a significant change relative to follicular dynamics. And all of those changes then actually manifest themselves into being able to palpate or distinguish where those heifers are at based on their pubertal status. And that's why we think it's a key determinant in terms of really assessing, number one, what you hopefully successfully achieved in terms of identifying potential replacements. 2, how good a job you've done relative to developing those heifers going into the breeding season. And 3, determining are those heifers really ready to be placed on a synchronization treatment. So a couple points relative to the TRACT scoring system. It is repeatable and accurate for determining pubertal status. And based on the work that's been done now at a number of different locations, including here at MSU, what we've found is that it is an effective predictor for pregnancy rates to fixed time artificial insemination. I'll show you some data here in a moment. Pregnancy rates by day 50 of the breeding season, then also in addition to that, obviously weaning weight of calves. The one point before I show you some of the field data from here in Missouri that I do want to highlight relative to these TRACT scores. For those of you that that purchase in replacement heifers, one caution I would offer is that always ask the question when you're purchasing heifers to develop and breed from an outside source is, have those heifers actually been implanted? This is a really nice study that was conducted by Skip Bartolt's group at Auburn University, where they looked at neonatal exposure to progesterone and estradiol on reproductive tract development in heifers. And what was done in this study was all these heifers that were implanted with the Synovex C implant. And you can see in terms of the treatment groups, there were heifers that were implanted at birth, at day 21, at day 45, and they were compared to a non-implanted control group. All of these heifers were allowed to reach pubertal status, and then the heifers were harvested on the same day of the estrus cycle, and the reproductive tracts were examined. And you can see, based on the weights and measurements that are reported in this table, just follow each of those rows across and look at the differences relative to tract development in comparison to the control. What this data shows us is the fact that the effects of these implants on reproductive tract development in terms of glandular development in the uterus are significant. And the point that needs to be emphasized is they are non-reversible. And so they can cause permanent, more or less, disruption of development, normal development of the reproductive tract. And so heifers that are being retained for breeding, we really advocate not using implants in those heifers. And in addition to that, again, ask the question, if you're purchasing heifers, have they been implanted prior to the time you assume ownership? So timing pre-breeding exams, we recommend 4 to 6 weeks before the breeding season. And the other point that we make is that our recommendation, based on the thousands that we've done over the years, is that we see failures in sync programs oftentimes when heifers simply aren't ready to synchronize. And that, in many cases, has been the black eye that a lot of these protocols has received, because the assumption is the protocols will work. They do work, but they also have to be administered to groups of heifers that are really ready to go on a treatment. And our recommendation over the years has been that when at least half or more of the heifers are assigned a tract score of 4 or 5, in other words, they are cycling at the time the exams are performed 4 to 6 weeks before breeding, those heifers are really ready to go on a protocol. And so what we find here in Missouri, many of the heifers in our heifer program statewide are going on the 14-day CEDAR. What we see happening is that it's more or less a one-stop shop. Pre-breeding evaluations can be performed at that time. Pre-breeding booster vaccinations are administered. And then many of our veterinary clinics now are getting actively involved with whole herd reproductive management, including synchronization and AI programs. And so it really condenses things in terms of minimizing the number of trips through the chute and increasing the number of more or less functions that can be performed at that particular time. So here's some data relative to our heifer program in the state. And what I've pulled out here are data that just speak to relationship between the reproductive tract scores and actual fixed time AI pregnancy rates. So the luxury we have with our heifer program here in Missouri, the Show Me Select program, is the fact that we have a centralized database. All of this data comes in and is compiled, but we have an opportunity to mine it. And this is data on roughly close to 43,000 heifers that all the heifers in our program are required to have a pre-breeding evaluation by veterinarians that work with the various farms and ranches that enroll heifers. But all of these heifers in this particular slide were appointment bred using one of the protocols that I'll show you in a subsequent slide. But just take a moment and scan across and look at the differences relative to how these heifers performed in terms of their timed AI pregnancy rate. And the point that I would make here is that the requirement in our program is that if the heifers are appointment bred, cleanup bulls cannot go in for 2 weeks after the appointment breeding. And so 90% roughly of the heifers in our program are being ultrasound preg checked. The preg checks have to be performed within 90 days of the start of the breeding season. So this, in terms of field data, is very clean, it's very precise, and it's really about the best we can do in terms of a program of this nature. But what you can see here is that only 4% of the heifers at tract scored 1 conceived to timed AI. I will tell you the vast majority of the heifers that are assigned a score of 1 now in our program, those heifers, in most cases now, do not see the breeding season. They're either sent to a sale barn or put on feed. 27% of the 2s conceived to timed AI, 48% of the 3s, and then roughly equal percentage pregnancy rates to timed AI among the 4s and 5s. If you then move to this next slide and look at the relationship between the timed AI preg rates and reproductive tract scores, and here what I've done is I've eliminated the heifers that scored and I've grouped the 2s and 3s in terms of non-cycling and the 4s and 5s into cycling. And the 3 protocols that are being used most extensively in our program here in Missouri are the 7-day coasting cedar, MGA prostaglandin, and then the 14-day cedar. And what you can see when you run the stats on these 3 groups and make the comparison, there's a significant advantage in terms of those heifers that have not yet reached puberty at the time the exams are performed among heifers that are going on the 14-day cedar. When we then move to the cycling heifers, the heifers that scored 4 and 5, you see improvements in all 3 categories relative to the protocols that were involved. But again, there's a significant advantage to the heifers that were on the 14-day cedar. And then when we move to this last column, which combines both the cycling and non-cycling heifers, this is the point that we really refer producers to in our program in terms of helping them identify a protocol, because very rarely do you find groups of heifers that 100% or even 80% of the heifers or more are cycling at the time treatments begin. And so what this data tells us is that when you're working with mixed groups of cycling and non-cycling heifers, it appears based on this data and the statistics bear it out that the 14-day cedar program really is giving us the best results in terms of time day eye results. What you can see here is that, and this is a function largely because of our veterinary community, we're talking here in terms of the total number of heifers assigned to each of these protocols, 1,800 roughly on the 7-day coasting cedar, a little over 800 on the MGA prostaglandin protocol, and close to 40,000 on the 14-day cedar. So you can see very clearly that the majority of the herds in the program are utilizing the 14-day program. So some take-home points for heifers: the protocols do work. All 4 of them work. And in choosing a protocol for time day eye in heifers, I think it's important that you begin considering pre-treatment estrus-cyclicity status of the heifers. And again, timing of when those exams are performed is an important point. In our opinion, the longer-term progestin-based protocols perform more consistently among mixed groups of cycling versus non-cycling heifers. I think there's some reasons for that we could perhaps discuss during the question and answer session, but we've had very, very good success with the long-term protocols, both MGA and cedar-based protocols. But again, a lot of the key to MGA is going to be whether or not you can get it into the cattle successfully. The other point that I want to make is that protocol compliance will determine success, and that refers both to product administration and timing of insemination. And when I refer to product administration, it's trying to ensure that you're giving the right product at the right time. In other words, if the protocol requires the use of GnRH, say for instance at cedar insertion, that you're making sure that you're administering GnRH and not prostaglandin, or vice versa at the time of cedar removal. So I want to quickly transition now into 2-year-olds, and our group had interest in looking at a comparison of the short versus long-term cedar-based protocols in 2-year-olds. The data that I'm going to show you over the next several slides, Jill Abel, who was a graduate student in my program, who's now DVM, led this trial, and much of the work was actually conducted in Montana with cooperating ranches over in the western part of the state. What we had an interest in doing was comparing the 14-day cedar that I talked about relative to heifers with the 7-day coasting cedar, in which case you can see in terms of the 14-day protocol, 14 days cedar in on a Monday, 2 weeks later comes out on a Monday, prostaglandin is administered 16 days later. But in the case of cows, the interval between prostaglandin administration is 72 hours versus 66, as we just spoke about in yearling replacements. And so in this case, GnRH was administered concurrent with the timing of insemination. In the 7-day treated cows, GnRH at cedar insertion, prostaglandin 7 days later at cedar removal, and all the cows on the 7-day protocol were administered or were inseminated at 66 hours after cedar removal and prostaglandin. So the ranches that we worked with in Montana, we had an opportunity to work with the Montana Department of Corrections at Deer Lodge, and then Lassance Ranch over at Dillon. Race King, the manager of that ranch, was just a gem in terms of working with us on this project. And then we also worked with the research herd that we utilized for a lot of our work here in Missouri at the Thompson Research Center at Pickard, Missouri. So we placed Estrotec patches on all these cows at the time prostaglandin was administered. And the point that I want to draw your attention to is those patches were then read at the time that the cows were inseminated. And so what you can see first off is that when we compared the 14-day treated cows to the 7-day treated cows, there was a significant reduction in the percentage of cows that had activated patches. In other words, had failed to express estrus at the time inseminations were performed. In comparison to the 7-day treated cows, 43% versus 74%. We look at the pregnancy rates now and begin first with the AI preg rates. Despite the differences relative to the lower heat response in the 14-day treated cows, the timed AI preg rates only differed by 1 percentage point. And again, all of these cows were inseminated on a given day, and then cleanup bulls were held out for 10 days in this case, and after for 10 days after the inseminations were performed. And then again, what we did was we performed an ultrasound roughly at about 70 to 80 days after the timed AI. If we look then at the pregnancy within the first 30 days of the breeding season, exceptional pregnancy rates on these 2-year-old cows, and then pregnancy rates at the end of a 60-day breeding season, roughly 95% of them becoming pregnant by the end of the breeding season. So one of the things that we did with the herd here in Missouri to really explain these differences in terms of fertility in the face of lower heat response, and typically what we assume is that higher heat response should, and in most all cases, does translate into improved pregnancy rates at fixed time AI. But in this case, we wanted to try and arrive at a better understanding of why we did see comparable pregnancy rates in the face of lower heat responses. And so we ultrasounded subsets of cows here in Missouri and looked at both follicular diameters on these cows as well as estradiol concentrations. And the interesting thing that we found is that in comparing the follicle diameters in terms of the dominant follicle diameters of these cows at the time of fixed time AI, the cows on the 7-day protocol had significantly higher dominant follicle diameters. But then when we looked at the estradiol concentrations of the cows, the trend more or less, or the differences more or less flip-flopped. So in other words, what you can see here is that the estradiol concentrations on the 14-day treated cows at the time of insemination were roughly 2-fold higher than the 7-day treated cows. Estradiol is a key contributor to improved fertility at the time of insemination, and so in our hands, we felt that in part helped to explain the similarities in terms of pregnancy rates resulting from fixed time AI in more or less in the face of lower heat response. So to conclude, the 14-day cedar and 7-day coasting cedar protocols effectively synchronized estrus prior to timed AI in these 2-year-olds. And essentially what it told us is that if properly administered, both protocols can work very successfully. The point that I want to finish this section on the 2-year-olds with, however, is the fact that it's important to understand that all of these 2-year-olds had been synchronized as yearlings. And so they were synchronized as 2-year-olds coming off a fairly concentrated calving period as first calf 2. So I think that was I think that contributed to the success that we saw. I want to transition now to cows, and one of the things that I think in comparison to heifers and determining whether or not heifers are cycling or not, in cows we have to try and have a handle on, or would hope to have some sort of handle on, who's cycling and who's not. In other words, who's returned to cycling status following calving. And this is a progesterone profile on a postpartum cow, and what you can see is that basically this short rise in progesterone, and then followed by more or less a normal cycling pattern in terms of progesterone concentration, is very typical and representative of roughly roughly 90% of the cows that returned to heat following calving. In fact, when I was a graduate student at Montana State and doing my master's research at the USDA station, Bob Short actually had data at the station that indicated that roughly 90% of all postpartum cows exhibit a pattern similar to what's illustrated here as they return to normal cycling status following calving. So one of the luxuries we have in terms of the tools we have to work with to more or less mimic this short rise in progesterone is either use of GnRH or and probably more predictably the use of the cedar. In the case of GnRH, it will be effective in terms of turning a follicle over and creating formation of an accessory CL, which is progesterone producing. But the thing you have to understand is that in order for that to occur, the cow has to have a follicle large enough to be capable of responding to that GnRH injection. And so it's not foolproof, and it's not going to really provide that opportunity for all cows in the group. On the other hand, when cedars are administered, essentially that does offer an advantage in that all cows are seeing the same level of progesterone over the period of time during which it's administered. So one of the questions we get is, how do fixed-time AI pregnancy rates compare based on pretreatment cyclicity status? And so the work that's shown on this slide represents work of a number of my former graduate students. And what we've done over the years is typically we'll take 2 blood samples on cows 10 days before and on the day treatments are initiated. And these cows were on various synchronization programs, all involving the progestin. But what you can see, the data represents a little over 3,000 cows. And when you boil the data down based on cycling versus those cows that were anestrus and had not returned to cycling status prior to the time that treatments were imposed, 54% of the cows were cycling and 46% of the cows had not yet returned to cycling status. And at the same time, just take a look at the timed AI pregnancy rates on these cows. 67.4% of the cycling cows became pregnant to timed AI versus 64% of the cows that were determined to have been anestrus at the time the treatments were administered. So just think about the significance of that data. When you think about the fact that it's not surprising on the cycling cows, although those are very good pregnancy rates at timed AI. But when you think about the fact that we successfully settled 64% of the cows that were anestrus roughly 10 days prior to the time the treatments were administered, that is in itself remarkable, and remarkable from the standpoint of, again, what it's accomplishing for herd owners in terms of grouping the calving season and moving some of those, perhaps in some situations, later calving cows up earlier in the calving profile. So in terms of the timed AI protocols for cows, the two that I want to just visit with you briefly about are the 7-day and the 5-day. I'm not going to speak at all about the Bos indicus influence timed AI protocols because, again, probably not talking about a large number of those in Montana. In the case of the two protocols, the two short-term protocols for cows, the 7 and the 5-day, again, the 5-day calls for 2 injections of prostaglandin, in this case, roughly administered 12 hours apart. And then timed insemination using that protocol on cows. The cows were inseminated 72 hours after the removal of the cedar and prostaglandin administration. And again, GnRH is administered concurrent with AI. 7-day protocol, again, our group here in Missouri has more or less adhered to a 66-hour interval between cedar removal and prostaglandin, or between cedar removal and AI. So if you look at the pregnancy rates after fixed-time AI, I begin first with the work from one of my former graduate students here in Missouri, Dallas Wilson. All of these cows were inseminated at the times illustrated on that previous slide, and as the data turned out, the pregnancy rates were identical in terms of the timed AI results, 67% for both groups. The gray bars, or the data highlighted in these gray rows, basically represent that of Dee Whittier's program at Virginia Tech, and what you can see with much larger numbers, in this case over 9,000 those cows were inseminated at 60 at an average of 69 hours, so a little bit later than what the work that we did here in Missouri was involved with. I want to go back again to this discussion of cycling versus ESTRUS cows and compare the pregnancy rates resulting from time to AI between the two treatment groups. If you look at all of these cows, again, were blood sampled from the group here in Missouri. And if you look at the cows that were cycling prior to treatment and their corresponding time to AI results, 70 and 64% of the cycling cows became pregnant. Numeric differences here, but not significant from a statistical standpoint. But then when we look at the cows that were actually anestrus or had not returned to cycling status at the time treatments were imposed, and you can see those numbers or percentages more or less flip-flop. But again, no statistical difference, but very good pregnancy rates, again, for cows that had not returned to cycling status at the time those treatments were imposed, roughly 7 to 10 days prior to insemination. We, as part of one of our USDA groups, our projects here in Missouri, worked with a number of herds in the state to more or less transfer the technology to the field and help people understand that the protocol can be made to work very successfully and enhance use of time to AI across the state. This was done several years ago, but we worked with 73 herds at the starting locations on the state map of Missouri. All these cows were appointment bred, coming off the 7-day co-sync cedar protocol. Inseminations were performed at 66 hours after cedar removal and prostaglandin, and the time to AI pregnancy rate on those 7,000 cows was 62%. We had 7 herds that were under 50%, and I think by herd we can go in and explain differences as to why that those herds may have performed lower. Sandy Johnson had compared the two protocols head-to-head and looking at the published literature, and essentially from looking at the results from the data that she compiled and then looking at the cows that we inseminated across the state here in Missouri. Basically what Sandy found is that if you look at the 5-day protocol based on published literature, and this is several years ago now, as you can see, over 2,000 cows. The time to AI preg rate was 62%, and again, that was the similar pregnancy rate that we observed with the herds that we worked with here in Missouri. So I want to conclude this section on cows very quickly with a brief discussion of does timing of insemination really matter? And we get this question a lot, and I think it's important that you understand that the recommended times on these protocol sheets really are there for a reason. So when the cedars first came online and there was a discussion relative to the recommended interval between cedar removal and prostaglandin using the 7-day protocol, the actual time of insemination range was recommended from as early as 54 hours to 66. And we felt, based on the work that we had been involved with this, was that 54 hours was just simply too early to perform a timed AI. So we worked with a little over 800 cows and put the two protocols or timings relative to the interval between cedar removal and prostaglandin, or timing of insemination rather, at 54 versus 66 hours. And what you can see here is that there was a significant advantage to the cows that were inseminated at 66 hours versus 54. With a little over 400 cows per treatment. And these are very good pregnancy rates for cows that were inseminated either 2 times, but these differences are significant, or from a statistical analysis standpoint. In other words, there's a biological difference or a reason for why those differences occurred. We typically, in conducting any of these trials, we want to be able to speak to any producer group that we work with and say with confidence, how close did we come to really inseminating those cows at the time that we said we were going to. So we record the time for individual cows at which time prostaglandin is administered and then when fixed time AI is performed. And what you can see here is that the mean time of insemination for the 54-hour cows was 54.2 and 66.2 for the cows in the 66-hour group. If we look at one of the locations where we had the luxury of heat watch using heat watch on these cows to who had been exhibited estrus prior to the time inseminations were performed. We had actual heat data on these cows, on roughly about 400 cows in total, a little over 200 per treatment. But what we saw was, in terms of the estrus response, only 26% of the cows in the 54-hour group had exhibited estrus versus 50% in the 66-hour group. And this is where the data, to me, really get interesting, is that if you look at those cows that exhibited estrus, comparing the 54 versus the 66-hour group, 65% of the 54-hour treated cows became pregnant to timed AI versus 81% of the 66-hour group. And this, taking into consideration that both groups of cows actually had moved on to the standing heat list using heat watch. Not big differences relative to the cows that had failed to exhibit estrus, but again, it really caught our attention when you looked at the differences among those cows that did exhibit estrus. So we did see that difference, and I think one of the reasons why is it relates to the relationship again to estradiol, but also the importance of timing in terms of insemination as it relates to estradiol, perhaps in terms of helping prepare the uterus to accept the pregnancy. And so I think that's in some part perhaps contributed to the improvement that we saw among the cows that were inseminated at the later hour. So some take-home points for cows. Again, the protocols do work. Choosing a protocol for timed AI in cows, I think, really should take in consideration the age, the average number of days postpartum, and body condition. And again, I can't harp enough on protocol compliance, both in terms of product administration and timing of insemination. We, along with other groups across the country, continue to get more calls that from producers saying that they've administered the wrong product at a particular time, and so there has to be some troubleshooting that goes on relative to kind of correcting those situations. So please make sure when you're using these protocols and administering various products that you've got the right one at the right time. I want to conclude with some work that Jordan Thomas, who completed his PhD in my program and who's now on our faculty here at MSU, initiated as part of his master's work, looking at this whole concept of split-timed AI. And the initial work relative to this, and Jordan has some really interesting work underway now in the whole area of sex-sorted semen, but that was the initial idea behind this, is that could you use this split-time AI concept to enhance or improve results with sex-sorted semen. And essentially what this is a modified approach to fixed time AI. And the question was asked, is it really feasible to optimize male and female fertility by better aligning the time at which AI is performed with when ovulation is expected to occur based on the actual expression of estrus, and then more or less use that expression of estrus to determine whether and when to administer GnRH. So what's been done in all of these studies that Jordan was involved with, and then followed by Breanne Bishop, who also contributed in large measure to this work, as well as Emma Nickmeyer, another two more of my graduate students. But in all of this work, we administer these estrus texts at the time prostaglandin is administered to these cattle, and then they're read at the time AI is performed. We consider an animal or a female to actually have exhibited estrus when at least half or more of those estrus texts, that scratch coating on those markers or on those patches has actually been removed. And so, in general, we think it's a very useful tool to really give you an indication of the response, whether you're using split time or AI or not. But retrospectively, I think it's also useful in terms of troubleshooting situations in the event that you may have not experienced a successful breeding season, and at least you can go back and refer to what the heat expression was, and was it, in some cases, perhaps lower, to help you understand why, or at least eliminate some of the factors that perhaps contributed to a decreased or reduced result. So in the case of split time AI, basically the idea is that the estrus texts are administered at the time prostaglandin or that estrotects are applied at the time prostaglandin is administered. In the case of the 14-day cedar and in the case of the 7-day coasting cedar-treated cows, basically the idea would be then that the patches go in and on at prostaglandin, and then at 66 hours for heifers on the 14-day cedar, the heifers that have activated patches are inseminated. No GnRH is administered, and likewise with cows, cows are inseminated at 66 hours, and no GnRH is administered. Basically, the idea is that if those cows have expressed estrus, they've already had their own endogenous LH release, and so or surge, and essentially the GnRH is more or less going to be wasted on those females. The idea then in terms of the split time is that those non-estrus females, both heifers and cows, are held over for a period of 20 to 24 hours later. And then the only females at that time that receive GnRH are those that remain non-estrus. In other words, those that continue to have only gray patches that have not exhibited estrus at that time. But all females are inseminated, all remaining females are inseminated. And again, only those that have not exhibited estrus receive GnRH at the time those inseminations are performed. So Emma Nickmeyer wanted to, as part of her master's, look at a comparison of the MJ and 7-day coasting cedar protocols using fixed time AI and split time AI approach. And basically, if you look at what we saw relative to a comparison of fixed versus split time AI in terms of estrus response, among heifers that were on the MJ protocol that were inseminated at predetermined fixed time, in other words, 72 hours after prostaglandin administration, 72% of those heifers had exhibited estrus, whereas by using the combined estrus response over those two time periods, that increased to 88% among the heifers that were assigned to split time. When we then look at what that accomplished relative to an improvement in time to AI pregnancy rate, it jumped from 46% to the in referring to the fixed time AI inseminated heifers, to 55% for the heifers that were assigned to the split time AI protocol. What's interesting then is when we looked at a comparison of fixed versus split time AI among heifers on the 7-day coasting cedar treated protocol, basically you can see here by comparing the two in terms of fixed time AI versus split time AI, there was a significant increase in the percentage of heifers that actually exhibited estrus that over those two time periods, as opposed to the single time period, comparing split time versus the fixed time AI group. But the interesting thing that resulted from this is that did not translate into an improvement in time to AI pregnancy rate. And the idea behind this, as far as our group is concerned, arises from a couple of different points. Number one, the response that you see in terms of GnRH response in heifers at the time the cedars are inserted on the 7-day group basically is much less predictable than it would be in cows. And so one of the things that could occur as a result of that, perhaps, is the fact that if we're not successful turning those follicles over, you could have a situation where heifers actually have formed a persistent follicle, which we know in the case of trying to inseminate those heifers then during that either time AI or split time AI period, then you can expect that you're going to see a reduced pregnancy rate among those females. The other thing that I think is perhaps more important, a more important consideration is that with these shorter protocols, looking at those heifers that were pre or peripuberal at the time the protocol began, and if those heifers actually exhibit estrus during that synchronized period or not, you're still attempting to breed those heifers on a puberal estrus. And actually, there's good data from Miles City, along with several other places, that if you compare pregnancy rates among heifers that are inseminated on their pubertal estrus versus the subsequent estrus, you can typically expect to see a decrease in terms of results. So I think that's perhaps maybe a larger contributor to those differences. So I want to conclude just showing you, based on heat watch data that we collected over the years using the 14-day protocol, breaking those heat distribution patterns down more or less incrementally. And so if we look at that time interval from 0 to 66 hours after prostaglandin on heifers, among heifers that are on the 14-day protocol, roughly based on the large volume of data that we've collected using heat watch with that protocol and heifers, you can expect about 75% of those heifers to exhibit estrus, up to 75% exhibiting estrus up to 66 hours, with a corresponding percentages of heifers illustrated in those subsequent panels of 14% from 66 to 90 hours, 5% after 90 hours, and then roughly about 7% that end up being non-responders. If we look at the MGA prostaglandin treated heifers, and again with heat watch, from 0 to 72 hours, which is the recommended time of fixed time AI, the data, at least in our hands, would illustrate or point to the fact that roughly 70% of those heifers can be expected to exhibit estrus versus 12% during that period of time from 72 to 96 hours, 10% after 96 hours, and then roughly 8% that are non-responders. So if we could then compare those in terms of estrus response and AI pregnancy rates, and begin first with the 14-day CEDAR treated heifers. And if we look at the pregnancy rates among heifers that are illustrated, that have been illustrated in the panel at the top, in terms of the 14-day group, 93% of those heifers actually were detected in estrus and were inseminated, and versus 87% of the heifers that were assigned to split time AI. And if you look at the corresponding AI pregnancy rates among the heifers that were detected in estrus and inseminated based on detected estrus, 56% of those heifers became pregnant versus 57% of the heifers that were inseminated utilizing split time AI. When we then move to the MGA prostaglandin treated heifers, you can see very similar results in terms of heat expression among those that were assigned to the heat detection and AI versus split time AI, 85 and 88%. But again, very similar differences, very similar pregnancy rates, comparing the heifers that were inseminated based on detected estrus versus those that were inseminated using split time AI. So the take-home message here is that we're essentially accomplishing identical results when we utilize split time AI, inseminating heifers using or with the aid of these estrotechs, and then inseminating accordingly at either one of those two times, with or without GnRH, as we are if we actually detect estrus and inseminate those heifers over a period of 6 days. And again, I want to emphasize the fact that what we consider to be a synchronized period following administration of prostaglandin is a period of 144 hours, or roughly 6 days. So in heifers, did split time AI increase results compared to fixed time AI? If we compare the 14-day, look first at the 14-day CEDAR and then MGA prostaglandin, what we found is that it increased pregnancy rates in both long-term progestin-based protocol treated groups. It did increase estrus response in the 7-day co-sting CEDAR treated heifers, but it did not offer any advantage in terms of subsequent AI pregnancy rates. So our recommendation at the present time relative to the use of split time in heifers is that we do think there's a place for it in using it in heifers that are going on either the 14-day CEDAR or the 14-day MGA prostaglandin protocol. And in cows, if you are using split time, obviously it involves a bit more work relative to managing the calves and those sorts of considerations. But in general, I think there is some benefit to be realized in terms of increasing the number of AI pregnancies. So finally, to conclude, I think very briefly, where do we go from here in terms of what the industry needs, and I think some of the next questions to be answered. I think one of the focal points is going to be on development of breeding strategies to expand use of sex-sorted semen in conjunction with fixed or split-time AI. And Jordan Thomas, as I indicated, is now on the faculty here in our Division of Animal Sciences, has really got some exciting work underway in that area. Jordan's also been involved with development of some new strategies to synchronize estrus in recipient females prior to embryo transfer. And Rachel Bonaker, a graduate student that Jordan and I co-advised, but Jordan more or less has led the research effort. There's going to be some exciting results coming out in that area. I think there's also going to be more work needed in the area of distinguishing sires based on fertility differences when used in conjunction with timed AI. And I think basically continued development of protocols to utilize either both fixed time or split time AI in more or less the Bos indicus influenced females, because as all of you know, probably not to the extent up in Montana as we do down here and further south, but they represent a sizable percentage of the U.S. cow herd, and I think they've been overlooked in many cases in terms of protocol development for use, expanded use of artificial insemination here in the U.S. The last point, which I'd close on relative to the discussion in general, is that events like we're having tonight, I think, are extremely important in helping translate improvements in a lot of this technology to industry partners. And the exciting thing to me, despite the troubled times that we're find ourselves in right now, is the fact that there has been so much improvement in the development of these protocols over time. They work very successfully if they're administered appropriately. And suffice to say, the improvements that you can realize over a shortened period of time by employing their use, I think, really offers the industry some exciting opportunities going forward. Very briefly acknowledge the research support you've been able to realize over the last really 20 years from the USDA Competitive Grants Program. And then obviously the support we've received from the pharmaceutical and AI industry, as well as ESTRATEC, and then allow the faculty and students that have contributed to this work, as well as a lot of the contributing ranches. And then Stan Locke, who was a great partner in terms of an industry collaborator who we lost here a couple years ago, really contributed a lot to our research efforts. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't drag this on too long. I'm sorry. I think a lot of the hiccups that we had at the beginning of the presentation were a result of my well, they were more on my end, suffice to say, than they were on Carla's end. So I apologize for that. But at any rate, I hope this helps clarify some things for you, may raise some questions. And with that, I guess we'd open it up to questions if there is anybody still listening. So.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Patterson. We have a few questions that were put over in our chat box that we'll start with, and then if there's anyone else at the end, just feel free to unmute your mic and ask. So first question, has anyone looked at pregnancy rates or calf development from those heifers that were implanted?
That's a good question. Obviously, the study that I showed you the results on in terms of glandular development, those heifers were not allowed to carry calves to term. I'm not aware of any study in terms of the progeny of those females. I can't really think that there would be any issue in terms of the progeny produced from those females if they do successfully conceive and carry a calf to term. But the point is that, well, there's two things. One being that permanent disruption of those uterine glands is obviously problematic in terms of those females as far as their overall reproductive capacity. But the second thing that from field data, when I was at Kansas State and I worked very closely with vet school there, and Dr. Mark Spire, who I worked with at K-State, he worked with a large number of herds across the state. And one of the things that on, in the early 90s, implants were being recommended for use in replacement heifers with the idea that you could really increase pelvic area on these females, and with the idea that you then decrease the incidence of calving difficulty. Well, that ended up being a pretty big misnomer, and the reason for it is that all the implant did really in terms of pelvic growth was really accelerated. So if you looked at pelvic areas of those females, at yearling age, basically there were differences. The implanted heifers in many cases, in most cases, had larger pelvises, but when those heifers were compared then to the in terms of pre-calving pelvic areas to the non-implanted ones, the non-implanted ones had basically caught up. So basically what it does is accelerates growth at a younger age. And so the thing that Mark Spire had shown was, or had reported, was that the herds that he had worked with, in addition of those that did conceive, his observation was is that the fallout of those heifers, in terms of a failure to rebreed in subsequent years, was higher in comparison to the non-implanted ones. So that's why, anytime I'm working with groups of folks that actually either, consider using implants on their own potential replacements or are purchasing heifers, it's always a really good idea to try and ask that question and find out. I ran into it when I was at the University of Kentucky when we started doing these TRACT scores, and we would get sets of heifers because we worked with some large developers back there in terms of, they'd buy in 600 to 800 heifers, develop them, and then breed them. And phenotypically, the heifers were exceptional. You'd walk into a pen and you'd think that any of the heifers would make exceptional replacements, but from just a phenotypic standpoint, in terms of their weight, condition, development, breed, etc. But that's where the whole TRACT scoring point really hit home with me, was is that you get into these heifers that look great on the outside, but then you'd get in and then into those heifers, and there was a complete disconnect in terms of how those heifers palpated in terms of reproductive tract development. And it's all a function of glandular development. Those differences are palpable. And so, it's something that, from a management standpoint, that I really think is an important consideration.
Thank you. Another question that we had, would it be cost effective to collect blood samples and then assess progesterone for cyclicity status prior to breeding versus doing the reproductive tract scores?
We actually, a faculty member over at our vet school here, Dave Harden at the vet school here, actually had a graduate student where they actually compared blood sampling, two blood samples, just as you're saying, to tract scores, and essentially, there were no differences at all in terms of an advantage of one over the other. For what we did when we began the program, our heifer program here in Missouri, was we worked with every single practitioner in the state that was working with herds enrolled in our program. And the idea is really not necessarily to teach people to palpate, but rather to calibrate them. And so, so if I were to palpate a heifer in Bozeman versus a heifer up, at Haver, I would ideally like to say that if I palpated that heifer in Bozeman and then called her a tract score 2 and then had someone in Haver evaluate that same heifer, I would hope that you would come up with a comparable interpretation. That's what we did. We more or less calibrated the veterinary community down here, and you can see by the numbers based on the data that I shared with you in terms of our field data. It's not perfect, but the thing is that it really has helped us in terms of identifying those heifers that uh, either are underdeveloped, perhaps maybe too young to go into the breeding season that you're trying to fit them into. But at the end of the day, you need to look at it as a group. And so if you've got 100 heifers that you're developing and wanting to breed, and you only have 20% of those heifers cycling at the time those exams are performed, I don't care what protocol you put them on, you're not going to be happy with the results. And so as I indicated, Jared Decker now in our group, based on the work that we've done down here and his interest on the genomics side, he has a USDA grant with that'll be looking at Red Angus and Hereford, and all of those heifers are going to be a number of heifers in both breeds will be track scored in terms of collecting the phenotypic data, and then all of those heifers will be genotyped as well to really begin understanding more or less the genetics of this particular trait, because it is important. There's a number of groups. There's good data out of USDA MARC in Nebraska looking at the significance of reproductive tract development on these heifers, i.e. tract scores, as it applies to early conception, not just success relative to timed AI programs, but it's not rocket science, but it's been one of the things that the number of years that we've worked with here in Missouri. I'm obviously a firm believer in it. And I understand some of the skepticism behind those people that don't see the value in it, but the data speaks for itself. Speaks for itself in terms of our use of it and how it's improved the results in AI programs in terms of really evaluating groups of heifers. I'll give you an example. In 2012 here, when we had the extreme drought, not only here in the Midwest, but across the country, as I said, all the data comes into our database. And so I had one of our AI technicians, a really conscientious tech down in the southwest part of the state, had a group of heifers that that particular herd had been enrolled in our program for years, and they had a very disappointing had disappointing results in terms of their timed AI program. And the herd owner was really, really upset. And he the AI tech was so conscientious. He called and he said, I just can't figure out what went wrong. And he said, the heifers appeared thinner, but he said he had nothing to really hang his hat on in terms of how or why those heifers performed as badly as they did. And so I said, well, we've got the data in the database. Let me go back and look at the track scores on those heifers. They didn't even have 20% of those heifers cycling, and they went on the 14-day feeder at the time the track scores were performed. And that goes back to the point I made relative to knowing how many are cycling at the time they go on treatment, and if you're under 50%, depending upon the group of heifers, depending upon which protocol, depending upon how far below 50% you're going to be, it'll really translate into significant differences in terms of results as far as pregnancy. So, yeah, to us, it's a very useful tool. But the thing I'm excited about right now is that if we can begin gaining a better understanding of the genetics or genomics related to puberty onset and reproductive tract development, I think that's going to be important. One additional point that I would make in terms of the numbers that we've done over the years, which makes sense. We see differences in terms of tract development on these heifers that are out of either higher maternal bulls or the extreme high growth bulls. And so it makes sense because you would expect differences in terms of age of puberty and in onset in these heifers based on those differences. And so again, over time, I think it won't be to say that one is bad, the other is good. It'll just help us understand the differences and how we might be able to manage those differently to allow them to better express their genetics for puberty.
Well, speaking of bulls, Dr. Patterson, Robert asked, to your knowledge, is there any study or information on MGA protocol use and then using rotating bulls for the breeding?
So, yes. So we conducted a large trial in Florida with the Deseret Ranch. In fact, we have a paper that's going to be coming out later this year. But we worked with Deseret with about 1,500 heifers, and we had those heifers split into 5 treatment groups. So 2 of the groups were one group was on MGA, the other group was on a cedar, both for 14 days. And then in both cases, bulls went into those synchronized groups 10 days after either cedar removal or MGA withdrawal. We do not advocate use of prostaglandin when you're using it in conjunction with natural service. And we compared that then to heifers that were appointment bred off those 2 protocols, and again compared to, we had one treatment group that was a non-synchronized control. So a non-synchronized control, 2 progestin natural service exposed groups, and then 2 progestin timed AI groups. The results with and these were an 1/8 to 3/8 Brahmin, and so you've got to take that into consideration. But the heifers that were on the progestin-based protocol, followed by natural service, performed very, very well. But the interesting thing about it was all those heifers were TRACT scored, and the differences that I showed you on those heifers here in Missouri in our heifer program, based on cyclicity status of those heifers pre-treatment, the numbers matched up very, very well. But yes, it can work very effectively, and in fact, I've worked with a number of herds over the years where they've used MGA and heifers, and followed by natural service, and then over a period of time, then that's been a good transition into beginning an AI program. But you need to pay attention to mating loads. So in other words, the number of bulls that you expose to these synchronized groups. So if you're using yearling bulls, I'd probably not exceed 1 bull to, I'd probably be in that range of 10 to 15 heifers per bull. But if you're using 2-year-old bulls and older, you can probably increase that a bit. When you consider the distribution of estrus with MGA natural service, when that sort of synchronized period is going to occur, the heats are going to be spread out roughly over 7 to 10 days versus 3 to 5 if you give prostaglandin. And so that's why we don't advocate use of prostaglandin in a natural service setting. But as long as you do BSEs on the bulls and are not overdoing it in terms of mating load, it works very well, very well. And so I should have showed that slide to begin with, because we had some good data when I was at the University of Kentucky, where we used it very successfully to get folks started on an AI program. But yeah, it'll work well. And the reason for waiting 10 days. So if you feed MJ for the 14 days, or you leave the cedar in for 14 days, then the reason for waiting the 10 days is first, you want to bypass that subfertile heat coming off withdrawal of MGA or removal of the cedar. But the other thing is that if you go back to that one graph, that progesterone graph that I showed on the postpartum cows, you'll see a degree of that occurring in heifers too, in terms of these heifers that you induce cyclicity in. So what that means is that when they have that induced heat coming off the cedar or coming off MGA, there will be a percentage of those heifers that were non-cycling prior to treatment that are induced following withdrawal, that will experience a short cycle. And so that short cycle will occur prior to typically day 33 or day 30, depending upon which protocol you're talking about. Although you will see a higher incidence of short cycles in MGA treated females as opposed to CEDAR. And so by waiting the 10 days, but by having the bulls in there 10 days later, you're going to catch those induced short cycle females on that heat that's going to be very fertile. And so really what you're doing is you're advancing pregnancy date on those heifers, and then also having the bulls in well enough in advance of when the bulk of that 7 to 10 day period is going to occur.
Great. The next question that we had was that, do you think that average daily gain, be it half a pound, or a pound and a half a day, would impact heifer puberty attainment and reproductive tract scores?
Yeah, I do. I think the thing is, so Rick Funston at the University of Nebraska and I go round and round on this. And part of the reason in terms of the heifer development, the target weight debate, so to speak, 55%, which Rick has used very successfully in Nebraska, versus a lot of the work that I did when I was working on my PhD in Kansas. We looked at 55 versus 65, and the thing that I think is really important to understand is that if you look at differences in age at puberty, there are big differences based on breed or biological type. So, as an example, the dairy breeds, Holstein, Jersey, those breeds of cattle typically will reach puberty at very early ages, young ages, and lighter weight. When you look at, black baldies, typically a lot of those heifers are going to be a very high percentage of those heifers, by and large, are going to be cycling easily by the start of a breeding season, or a high percentage of them, 12 to 15 months of age. And age of puberty is not going to typically be a problem, even at those slightly lower target weights. But if you get into the higher growth, lean muscle breeds, or the indicus, any of the indicus or indicus crosses, where we know puberty typically can be expected to occur at older ages and heavier weights, then if you decrease average daily gain, or in other words, you compromise in terms of nutritional development of those heifers, then basically what you've done is you've taken a complicated situation and made it worse. And so, the thing that I will tell you is that even among the, as an example, the black baldy heifer as an example. When I was at K-State, we had heifers that were half sisters that were split into two groups, developed to 55 versus 65. And what we found is that the heifers that were developed to the lower target weight, there was, well, first of all, in terms of comparing them at yearling age in terms of age of puberty, there was no difference in terms of age of puberty. That was then followed by no difference in terms of date of conception during the first breeding season. But what we found is that there was a twofold, and this was at a time before we really had, as much confidence in APDs. APDs were just more or less becoming available. This was back in the 80s, 84. But the thing is that really what we found is that when we took pre-calving pelvic measurements on those females, we reduced pre-calving pelvic area by 13 square centimeters on the heifers developed to the lower target weight, and we ended up having twice the incidence of calving difficulty. The heifers were all inseminated with semen from the same sire, and then they were cleaned up with half brothers of the bull that was used artificially. And so the point that needs to be made relative to development and nutritional development and reproductive outcomes is that first of all, you can expect differences relative to breed or biological type. But within those breeds or biological types, you're also going to see variation going back to, the genetic selection that's been placed on a particular breed, i.e., Angus. If there's been heavy selection pressure placed on maternal traits, then those heifers will probably, be expected to reach puberty at younger ages and lighter weights. And the same holds true to whether or not there's a lot of milk in the genetics of those heifers. On the flip side, if they're really high growth, later you can expect those to be later maturing. And so if you compromise those heifers nutritionally and feed to that lower target or lower average daily gain, then you're going to expect a higher percentage of those to be non-cycling going into the breeding season and probably conceiving later during the breeding season. And if you go back to the horrible results that we saw in terms of reproductive failure in the 90s, late 90s, and in that time frame, there was a large influx of continental European breeding into the U.S. cow herd. And what was happening is that folks were developing heifers more or less, with the idea that they should be developed similarly to what had been how they'd approached British or British crosses. And what happened really is that the fallout rate on 2-year-olds exploded. And if you look at that, was pretty much true across the industry. And that's why there started to be so much emphasis placed on heifer development. And so, you have to take those things into consideration. And so our rule of thumb has been, you have to look at the economics. How much feed are you going to be able to afford to put into these heifers? But then at the same time, you have to think about, all right, it's an investment, and reproduction, successful reproduction comes at a cost, and it's all part of a management picture in terms of the genetics of the animal, the selection that you've made relative to the heifers you've chosen to retain. And so you have to put all those pieces together. But, to me, developing to that slightly higher target, which translates in some cases perhaps then to a bit higher higher average daily gain, to me, it's a bit of an insurance policy. And so if you're doing large numbers, really large numbers, where you have the more or less luxury to peel off the top that perform the best relative to putting selection pressure on early puberty and early conception, then fine. But if you don't have that luxury, then your goal should be to try and get as many heifers pregnant during that first breeding season as possible. And so I qualify the answer based on size, the size of the replacement group and all the other things that I discussed. But there's it's not a cookie cutter. That one size doesn't fit all, and you have to take all those points into consideration when you're trying to decide how to juggle development of a group of heifers.
Okay, another question. What do you suspect a similar program to that of your Show Me Select program? Do you think that would thrive here in Montana? What's the advantage to the producers if there was a program like that?
Well, we're actually getting a lot of interest from other states, and actually some of the breed associations in terms of considering, trying to implement it within an association as an example, and there's discussions underway relative to that. So the first thing I would say is that so I more or less worked with a group of producers in Central Kentucky that when I was at the University of Kentucky, that came to me, and since I'd worked with heifer development programs as part of my PhD, that they came to me with the concerns that they were not getting a lot of their heifers cycling going into the first breeding season. Heifers were conceiving mid to late. They were realizing or thinking that they had too many open at the end of the first breeding season. And then the fallout rate, and this goes back to the point that I made earlier, the fallout rate in terms of 2-year-olds was not, was not acceptable. So the idea was, basically, how do we take all that we know about heifer development that's, been researched over the years, and how do we put it together in the form of a program? And that's what we did, and that's what Show Me Select is patterned after. So when I interviewed for the position here, the idea was, how do we implement a program like that here in the state? Because we're the, we rotate back and forth with Oklahoma in terms of either being second or third in terms of cow numbers. We have about 2.1 million cows in across Missouri. So suffice to say, it's a major player in terms of cow, the cow calf side of things. And so, the whole idea was how do you, number one, improve management? How do you improve reproduction? And at the same time, how do you then begin using that to improve genetics? And so we began the program. We had the luxury here of having an in-house competitive grants program, and the university saw their way clear based on the proposals that we submitted for funding. To date, the university has probably, more or less contributed about $1.5 million to implementation of the program statewide. And along with that, in more recent years now, we're enhancing the database to where, all the information since its inception has been captured, but trying to put that together to where it's much more usable, not only by us here on campus, but our field staff and our producers and our veterinarians. And so I guess to answer your question is that I think it has a place everywhere. I think, the thing that I really like about it is the fact that it creates a whole new opportunity for producers in terms of really working closer with their veterinarians, more or less creating a conduit to introduce new technology into the industry. But the thing I really like about it is the fact that then we have the marketing piece. And so the marketing piece, and at some point, if you'd be interested, we could take time and have a similar webinar on what we've learned from the program. But the thing that it does is it gives our producers more or less feedback in terms of what technology does for them in terms of the value of the animals they produce, but the equity they build in their herd. Understanding that, at some point along the line, all of these herd owners will, in all likelihood, sell their cows or else pass it on to the next generation. And if that's the case, the decisions and the technology that you're using to improve that herd should be done thoughtfully in a way to where you actually are building equity. And so the thing that, as an example, what we've seen in our heifer program is that when we started time breeding, basically we started time breeding more cows. And we started using, more producers started using elite genetics on these commercial cows, and we ended up with half sisters out of really good bulls. And so you put those heifers into the program and then market them as synchronized groups of half sisters that are then bred back artificially to high accuracy bulls. So that led to the development of what we call Tier 2 in our program. So those heifers are distinguished at the time of sale. Those heifers capture a significantly higher value at the time of sale in our sales across the state than heifers that we don't know as much about the genetics. And then more recently, with Jared Decker's involvement in the program, we now have what we call Show Me Plus heifers. So those heifers actually are genotyped. And so they have the genetic profile in those heifers as well. And so those heifers also are capturing a higher value in sales across our state. The other thing that we've done on the sire side is that we require bulls that are used in the program artificially have to meet certain accuracies for either calving ease primarily or birth weight. And then in addition to that now, bulls that are used naturally, those bulls all have to are required to have a genomic enhanced DPD. And so what it's done is it's really helped our producers begin to understand how to use the information, but then at the end of the day, really what happens is that they have an opportunity to really assess the economic value of use of that technology as they've implemented in their herd. So that's, it's a very complete program. And the other thing that I really appreciated about it is the fact that, it really has engaged our veterinary community in a much different way than they ever had an opportunity to be involved with herds before. In many cases, as all of you know, they probably and typically react or involved in a more reactive way when there's a problem. But now many of our veterinary practices are involved in the total herd management, and it's a good situation for the farm or ranch, and it's a really good opportunity for the veterinarians to really more or less expand what they're able to provide in terms of support for these herds. So I think it has a place. I'd love to see Montana do something like it. I mean, there's a lot of really great cattle up there, and the idea behind this is that it was largely developed with the commercial man in mind, or the commercial herd owner. That said, we have a lot of the participants in our program are small seed stock operators. In some cases, not necessarily small, but they do very, very well in our program sales as well. But, in some cases, it has become a whole new enterprise for herds down here. We have a number of herds now in the program that have sold well in excess of $1 million worth of heifers in the program over the years. It's changed their operations. And when groups of heifers enter the ring from specific consignments that have been in the program ever since its inception, the bidding explodes. And typically those heifers go to repeat buyers, because we have a lot of herds now, not only here in Missouri, but in neighboring states, that sole source all their heifers out of our program. Because a lot of people just aren't they don't have the resources or the facilities or the time and to really develop heifers. And if they can find a source that provides them consistency in terms of the quality of replacements they're getting, then that's what they've opted to do.
Well, thank you. We're just going to have to figure out a way to either get you to come up here and talk about the program a little bit more. We will have another webinar.
Oh, I'm glad to do that.
We'll certainly try to do that. Well, now I'd like to open it up. If there was anyone that would like to ask a question, just using their microphone, be it on the web or by connection to phone. Okay, well, I think that might be it on questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Patterson, for taking the time to answer the questions that we had, and for giving us that wonderful presentation. You're definitely just a wealth of knowledge, and thanks for being patient with with the use of this webinar and those issues that we had at the beginning. We really appreciate your time today. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I got cut off there for a minute. I had to call back in. No, I hope I didn't drag this on too long. I, again, apologize for the problems up front. I think most of those were caused by me, but I appreciate the invitation. And if anybody is still on that has questions, or if you've gotten questions, Carla, just forward them on, and I'll try to respond as best I can. So thanks again.
Well, thank you, sir. Well, everyone, thanks for joining us this evening, and be sure to join us Thursday next week for our next seminar. So we will end on that note. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Stay safe, stay well.